On the 17th of November 1915, hundreds of men were boarding a hospital ship in France, just across the channel from where I am now. Most of them had suffered life-changing injuries, but ultimately it meant that for them, the war was over. And boarding a hospital ship to carry them back across the channel to their homeland should have been the end of what would have been a horrible experience. They'd survived the trenches, they'd survived massive aerial bombardments, and a lot of them had survived very, very dangerous operations. But in a few hours' time, they'd be home and it would be over. But that's not what happened. They'd almost made it home. In fact, they're about a mile out from where I'm standing right now. In fact, standing here, you would have been able to see them. And that is when, within touching distance of home, everything went wrong. And that hospital ship full of hundreds of wounded soldiers for whom the war should have been over ended up at the bottom of the English Channel. That ship's name was HMHS Anglia, and this is her story.
Built by William Denny and Brothers at Dumbarton and completed in 1900, Anglia was originally a passenger ferry operated by the London and North Western Railway Company, and she spent her first years of service carrying civilian passengers across the Irish Sea between Holyhead, Liverpool and Dublin. She was solid, fast, reliable and comfortable, and could achieve speeds of over 20 knots. And she managed this original task of ferrying people across the Irish Sea for many years admirably, right up until August 1914. The outbreak of the First World War, of course, meant many civilian ships were requisitioned for service.
Now, as a ship, there wasn't anything, particularly remarkable about the Anglia, but she was one of many, many civilian vessels that were requisitioned for the war. And like many of those civilian vessels, became a vital part of the war efforts.
And of course, we'll get on to what her role would eventually become in the war. But initially, she was requisitioned as an armed boarding steamer. Almost certainly because of her speed, because essentially boarding steamers' role was to enforce wartime blockades. So they would speedily catch up with and intercept foreign vessels, then ultimately sending a boarding party on board to see what they were up to and taking whatever action was required.
But it was in 1915 that she was converted into a hospital ship, so all of her passenger spaces were converted to look after wounded men.
And this would ultimately become the last purpose that HMHS Anglia would serve. Now, whilst Anglia was busy serving her new purpose, 1915 had also seen another serious development when it came to naval warfare. Germany had embarked upon its first unrestricted U-boat campaign, with commercial shipping being heavily targeted throughout the year. In fact, this resulted in one of the most famous cases of a ship being sunk by a U-boat. I am, of course, talking about RMS Lusitania. And despite Lusitania being sunk in May of 1915, its name is going to come up again later in this story. Now, through fear of provoking US involvement in the war, the U-boat campaign was kind of pulled back a little bit from attacking commercial shipping. But of course, even though they weren't necessarily being specifically targeted anymore, the operating of civilian and other non-essentially battleship vessels in the channel and the surrounding waters continued to be a very dangerous affair. And so merchants, fishing vessels, all kinds of shipping that were operating at this time were definitely still vulnerable. In fact, in November alone, around 60 non-naval ships were actually sunk by U-boats. U-boats themselves had several options available to them when it came to offensive action. They of course had torpedoes, they were capable of shelling if surfaced, they could place explosive charges aboard ships using boarding parties, or they could lay mines through important shipping lanes. And the coast around Dover and Folkestone was one of those areas targeted by German U-boats.
Now, war is, I'd hesitate to ever really call war honourable, but there were still men alive during the First World War who considered there was a certain way of waging war. There was a certain way opposing officers went about conducting themselves when it came to, ultimately killing each other. But the idea of just leaving explosives behind to just take out whoever happened to come across it, whether that be a civilian or a military vessel. Whatever you think about how war is waged and whether there are nice ways to do it, it's definitely not the nicest way to do it.
Now, it's of course not hard to understand why what was about to happen to Anglia mattered and was so devastating. But a little context never hurts. By November 1915, the war was little more than a year old, but the casualty lists were already terrible. We'd already had Ypres, Luce, Neuve-Chapelle, names and places that have now, many, many decades later, become synonymous with the slaughter that took place there. And those that survived but were seriously wounded were being shipped back across the channel week by week, day by day. And those on board represented every corner of the British Empire. There were English, Scottish, Welsh, Irish, Canadian, Australian, New Zealanders. Some boarding these ships to return to Britain had only just been wounded, whilst others had been enduring weeks of strenuous, intense, stressful, horrible treatment near the front lines. But all of them had one hope, and that was to get home alive. And on the morning of the 17th of November 1915, Anglia departed Boulogne carrying hundreds of these wounded soldiers. Now, the sources vary slightly on the exact numbers on board, but from contemporary accounts, they seem to indicate that there were at least 350 wounded men aboard Anglia when it left Boulogne.
These were men who had suffered catastrophic injuries, and even if they hadn't, were at the very least suffering from severe trauma or, shell shock, as it would have been back in the day.
In fact, around 166 aboard were called cot cases, basically meaning they were stuck on a stretcher or stuck in a bed. Now, for most of the few-hour trip across the channel for Anglia, things went perfectly fine. And as she approached the Kent coast, she approached a location known as the Folkestone Gate, which was an important gap in the British defences for Allied ships to be able to pass through safely. And just after noon, Anglia reached the Folkestone Gate.
Behind me here are the White Cliffs of Dover, obviously, I don't need to say they're iconic, everybody knows, but they were iconic for a reason, and especially during both wars. They were iconic because France is there. I don't know if you can make it out on there, you probably can't make it out on here. Just in case you don't know, you can see it from Dover. And so when the conditions were right, those who were either, stationed just over the channel or were making their way back on boats, these cliffs were an ever-present, ever-visible reminder of home. That's why songs from that era have been written about the cliffs.
Bluebirds over the white cliffs of Dover.
They're this hugely romantic symbol. And so you can only imagine, because this was really ramped up, obviously, during both wars, this sense of home and the iconography of home. And so for those soldiers making their way back, the sight of the cliffs would have definitely filled them with a sense of homecoming, safety, finality to the war being finally over for them. And so the idea that these soldiers were, many of them possibly, out on the deck, because, these hospital ships were often filled to capacity, so there would have been soldiers above and below deck. They could see homecoming, and so to be that close and to suddenly have everything thrown back into terrifying chaos, it's just unimaginable. Obviously, there's no good time to be in a situation like this, but for them, they would have already felt like they were safe.
At this point in the journey, it should have been a routine stage in a routine crossing. They were at the last hurdle to cross before ultimately disembarking. But what they didn't know was that hidden just beneath the surface of the waves was a threat nobody could see. Days earlier, a German mine-laying submarine had managed to slip through those British defences. It had quietly gone about its purpose and then left. And what it had left floating silently beneath the surface of the Channel waters, was about to find a target.
The English Channel during wartime was never really considered safe, but by late 1915, Britain had become a lot better at safely moving shipping and personnel across it. And a key part of that was the Dover Patrol that tirelessly worked to make sure that shipping routes were open and that key routes were clear of mines. And by this point, a lot of voyages were passing without incident, which is why what happened here in November took a lot of people by surprise.
I was a coxswain of HM Torpedo Boat Number 4, attached to the Dover Patrol. On the day the Anglia hove in sight, we were about 5 miles east of Folkestone. The Anglia was returning home wounded from France. As she approached and passed us, our crew waved and cheered the Tommies and nurses crowding the Anglia's decks. A few minutes later, we heard a terrific explosion.
At approximately 12:30 p.m, a violent explosion tore through Anglia's port side, just forward of the bridge, leaving a huge hole on the port side. The passengers who moments earlier had been resting in wards, on stretchers, on beds, suddenly found themselves thrown into chaos. The bridge was seriously damaged. Communications were immediately disrupted, meaning the wireless operator, who was reportedly also injured in the blast, was unable to effectively send out distress calls. In fact, Captain Lionel John Manning, who had been thrown from the bridge when the explosion occurred, had run straight to the radio operator, but found the controls damaged and the radio operator covered in blood. But the most frightening development came almost immediately. Anglia immediately began to settle by the bows, listing heavily to port. Water surged into the various compartments. Those converted wards, which had been places of treatment, suddenly began to flood with freezing cold Channel water. Almost immediately, some of the most seriously wounded men were trapped with no chance of escape. And as Anglia's list to port became worse and worse, another realization became rapidly clear. With the ship quickly listing over to one side, many of the lifeboats aboard were either immediately submerged in water or were just incapable of being launched, meaning that whilst she was going down, only one lifeboat was got away. And when you factor in that each lifeboat could take no more than 50 people, it was immediately clear that survival was going to come down to sheer dumb luck. What's incredible though is that the contemporary reports show that despite the clear awfulness of this situation, order aboard this doomed vessel was maintained as well as it possibly could be. And the behaviour of the wounded and the medical staff aboard was incredible, with countless examples of incredible courage and discipline.
Now obviously today it's very nice, the Channel's looking very blue behind me, really nice. It wouldn't have been quite like this in November in 1915, but standing here just after midday, HMHS Anglia would have been very, very visible out there behind me. In fact, there are boats out there I can see quite clearly now, which are probably about the same distance out. And so anyone standing here would have both seen the blast and then heard it as well, and would have had to spend the next agonizing minutes watching from a distance as hundreds of people fought for their lives.
Captain John Manning immediately realised how serious the situation was. There would be no battle to save the vessel. There would be no dramatic attempt to reach safe harbour. The priority was not with the ship. There was nothing that could be done for Anglia now. It was for the people still aboard. But that was going to present a challenge almost as impossible as saving the ship itself. As Anglia continued to list further to port, crew members and medical staff rushed through the wards as quickly as they could. Many witness accounts describe nurses helping injured soldiers from their beds and trying to help guide them towards the upper decks, with other nurses remaining by the bedsides of those who couldn't get out.
Among those on board helping the wounded soldiers, were doctors, Royal Army Medical Corps personnel, and nurses from Queen Alexandra's Imperial Military Nursing Service. And one of those nurses was Staff Nurse Mary Rodwell.
Born on the 29th of February 1880 and training at Hendon Infirmary from 1901 to 1904, she'd worked at the Maritime Free Hospital and then later as a private nurse. But when war broke out, she immediately volunteered for the Foreign Service, working initially on hospital trains before she then joined HMHS Anglia. Throughout this disaster, Mary Rodwell refused to leave the helpless men. The last person to see her on deck was the matron. Apparently, she was fetching warm woolies for the casualties below decks. An ultimately futile gesture, but a demonstration that the care and comfort of those under her charge was what mattered most, even though Mary must have known that staying with them would certainly lead to her death. Her last minutes were spent in caring for them, as when the explosion came, she was ministering to the wounded. Nurse Mary Rodwell was the only nurse to go down with the ship, and her body was never recovered. It also speaks volumes that for some of those nurses, even after the disaster, their thoughts were still about the men they were trying to save.
There was no panic whatsoever. And when one realises that the majority of cases they were suffering from fractured limbs, severe wounds and amputations, it speaks volumes for their spirit, their grit and real bravery, for they must have suffered agonies of pain.
The scene was chaotic, not because people were behaving badly or dishonourably, but simply because time was running out. The wounded were arriving on the upper decks faster than they could be evacuated from the ship, and the ship was going down faster than anyone would expect. And of course, every minute the boat continued to list made launching the lifeboats even more difficult. The most profound impression left on the survivors were the accounts of nurses remaining completely calm whilst the vessel settled lower and lower into the water. Instead of rushing to safety, they continued to help wounded men reach the deck. In the middle of a huge disaster, their primary concern was still the men they were caring for. They were putting their patients first. They were still doing their duty.
In my ward there was one sister and two orderlies. The sister worked like a lion. As long as I live, I shall never forget her. In about 7 minutes she had me extricated, and when I got on deck I saw two sisters and the matron fastening on lifebelts and assisting the helpless men. They never gave a thought for themselves. They moved about with quick, workmanlike movement, no flustering. Not for a moment did they lose their heads. They presented a sight I shall never forget. Faces as white as death, hair blowing loose in the bitterly cold wind, and their hands and aprons literally covered with the blood of the men they were helping. I begged the matron and the two sisters to get into the boat which had come alongside, but they wouldn't hear of the suggestion. Not until the water was lapping over my feet did I slide off, and up to then, not a single nurse had left her post in the sinking ship. It was heart-rending to see their single-minded devotion to the wounded chaps under their care. "No," said the last nurse I spoke to aboard the Anglia. "Our duty is to see you men off safe. We have the right to be last this time."
And amongst this, some of those wounded who were still able to move in some way were trying to get themselves out as well. There are many reports of amputees struggling to find the strength to get onto the upper decks, and even some of those continuing to try and swim once they'd fallen into the water.
2 miles away we could see the Anglia settling down in the water after having struck a mine. At that time we were not sure whether she'd been mined or torpedoed, but later we learned that the explosion was caused by a mine. It's perhaps as well for us, because if the Anglia had been torpedoed, a submarine lurking in the vicinity might have hampered rescue operations. Our helm was put hard over, and engines at full speed, while racing to the scene of the disaster. We seized upon every object that would float and support human beings, with the idea of throwing these things overboard at the scene. As we approached the stricken ship, we could see men jumping overboard. When the torpedo boat got alongside, it was difficult to make our orders understood for a strange reason. The Anglia's siren was blowing the whole time. In the confusion that followed the explosion, the siren cord had been pulled too hard so that it jammed. To make matters worse, we dare not pass our wires or hawsers to secure the torpedo boat to the sinking ship, because she would have dragged us to the bottom. We therefore did the best we could in the circumstances. Though it was extremely difficult to get wounded soldiers aboard, we saved 170 of them. Some were able to cling to buoyant objects we threw into the water. It was a terrible sight. So many of those men could only partially help themselves.
Then, as those still on board still fought desperately to get off and away from the ship, it was gone. Witnesses later described how the vessel settled rapidly before disappearing beneath the channel. The hospital ship that had left Boulogne, carrying with it the hopes of hundreds of wounded, vanished beneath the water within sight of the English coast.
Now, reports from the time suggest that once she struck the mine, Anglia remained afloat for around 15 minutes. Now, 15 minutes might sound like a long time when you think, well, all you've got to do is jump off of the ship. That's not going to take 15 minutes. But again, this was 15 minutes to evacuate hundreds of people who were in severe need of medical attention and in a lot of cases severely debilitated. And so 15 minutes to evacuate hundreds of men, 15 minutes to launch all of the lifeboats on board the vessel, 15 minutes to save hundreds of lives, it just wasn't enough.
Of course, not being that far out from the coast, when HMHS Anglia went down, she settled onto the shallow seabed, with her masts still rising up above the water's surface. For any still on board, there was now no escape, and for those already in the water, their ordeal was only just beginning. Floating, wounded, in the brutally cold November waters, all they could do was wait for rescue.
Fortunately, this is where the fact that it did happen so close to home became a huge advantage for them, because many, many people in other vessels had witnessed what had happened. And so almost instantly, a lot of vessels responded. And one of the first was HMS Anglia.
Now, of course, one of the big risks with attempting rescue from a stricken ship like this is there's usually a lot of people in the water and debris all surrounding this sinking vessel. And so you've got to get in close, but you also don't want to make the situation worse. So nothing about this was straightforward. But despite this, HMS Anglia drew in close enough to take off as many as she possibly could. Anglia then transferred them to a nearby collier.
And that vessel had a familiar name. It was the collier Lusitania.
Not, of course, RMS Lusitania, who we know had been torpedoed in May of that year. Another Lusitania. But this other Lusitania was doomed to suffer a similar fate. This Lusitania had been nearby when the mine exploded, and had immediately turned to assist, launching 2 boats as she did. Those boats, launched by the Lusitania, managed to pull in underneath the stern of HMHS Anglia, which had now risen high enough for them to get under, but also to reveal her propellers, which were still rotating, just to add to the danger and drama of the situation. Around 40 men were able to jump from Anglia's stern onto those 2 boats and get away. As they did, HMS Anglia managed to come across the sunken bow of Anglia, and more survivors were able to clamber off onto Anglia that way. Those 2 boats full of survivors were making their way back to Lusitania, and that's when things got even worse. Unknown to the crew of the Lusitania, another mine left by that German U-boat had been floating dangerously nearby, and as the 2 boats drew up alongside her, she hit it Fortunately, the crew managed to get off and onto those boats alongside before she also eventually settled and rolled over. Throughout this, more and more ships were arriving to pull other survivors aboard. Lusitania stayed where she was, keel up, for some time, before eventually sinking below the waves. This all puts into context the incredible bravery of those who came to aid both ships. Having now witnessed 2 vessels strike mines and go down, they would have been well aware the risk they were placing their own ships when heading to aid those who were still in the water.
While rescue work was in progress, the captain of TB4 received news that our boat had been hulled and that water was pouring into the warhead magazine. This disturbing news was treated with the utmost secrecy. We breathed not a word of this to the wounded soldiers we'd rescued, not until the danger was over. Our engineers worked feverishly to keep the water under control, and they managed to do so. Meanwhile, other vessels appeared to the scene of the disaster, and we still stood by while the Anglia was sinking.
Now, given how little time there was between striking the mine and sinking, and given how vulnerable and incapacitated many of those on board were, it's incredible that the casualty list was not far, far worse. The incredible efforts of everyone on board and those who came to aid meant that many were able to survive, but the casualty list was still awful.
Now, as with a lot of disasters like this during both wars, the official numbers are always somewhat hard to gauge, and there ends up always being a little bit of wiggle room, a little bit of guesswork. Most modern historical studies of the disaster place the death toll at around 160. That's approaching 200 people who thought they'd made it home.
The 164 lost in this disaster were nursing sister Mary Rodwell, 9 Royal Army Medical Corps staff, 129 wounded men, and 25 of Anglia's crew.
Now, there's one possible story from this disaster that really helps the human tragedy of something like this hit home.
And for this story, we head back over to the doomed Lusitania.
The supposed last man off the ship. I say man, I should say boy. That last person off was supposedly a 14-year-old assistant steward called Herbert Scott. Yes, you heard that correctly, 14 years old.
The conduct of the medical staff aboard was widely praised in post-disaster reporting, with many of the survivors crediting the nurses and crew with helping to save their lives during those frantic final minutes.
I was able to watch the work of 6 nurses aboard the sinking ship. They were carrying helpless soldiers, the cot cases from down below to the upper deck. It was splendid work. The cool way in which they went on helping the wounded while the ship was going down. We shouted to them to think of their own lives and ordered them to jump over the stern of the Anglia. They refused to desert the cot cases. We dropped astern in the hope that they would jump and that we should pick them up as they drifted towards us. We waited until the Anglia took the final plunge, though we searched carefully. We saw no trace of those heroic nurses.
Chrysop ends his account by noting, tragically, that TB4 was blown up off the east coast of Kent, and 7 of her crew, who'd been there to help rescue people from the Anglia, were killed. But whilst rescue and recovery efforts were still going on, another question was emerging. How had this been allowed to happen? How had mines been placed so close to home? And could this have been prevented? And ultimately, that was a difficult question to answer then. It's a difficult question to answer now. The channel, despite not necessarily being considered open ocean, is vast, and minefields, especially back then, were incredibly difficult to detect. And with German submarine tactics evolving rapidly throughout 1915, Britain was still only just learning how to counter them. So there is little evidence that there is anything Captain Manning or the crew of Anglia could have done to avoid hitting these mines. She and those lost aboard her ultimately became victims of a new kind of warfare that neither side had yet fully adapted to.
It's generally thought that the submarine responsible for this was almost certainly the German mine-laying sub UC-5.
UC-5 was a small 168-ton mine-laying submarine. Now, its career ultimately only lasted 1 year, but the mines she planted during that time accounted for the loss of no less than 28 ships.
We've touched in some of my other videos where we cover U-boats, and particularly the wrecks that you can still see in the River Medway. This was a very, very insidious new form of warfare. And what it ultimately meant, and what Anglia found out in the worst possible way, was that the idea that there were certain types of vessel, there were certain things that you didn't do in war. And one of those things was you definitely don't attack a hospital ship. There's a reason they're painted the way they are, so they're readily identifiable, and so they're left alone. But mine-laying, submarines, that blew all of that out of the water, to use a, let's say, poor choice of words, and it made something like this sinking of a hospital ship completely indiscriminate and ultimately unavoidable. As soon as warfare started to be conducted this way, this was always inevitably going to happen.
Now, UC-5 actually ended up having a bit of a weird end to her career. In April 1916, she actually ran aground just off the British coast and was recovered and put on display in the Thames. And recovery was not straightforward because there were still 2 mines left aboard, and the captain had apparently also rigged up explosive charges to wreck the U-boat if it was abandoned. Then, once the US entered the war, she was actually moved to Central Park in New York. So UC-5 in its post-service career actually became something of a propaganda machine. The victims of this were buried across Britain and are included on the Tower Hill Memorial in London, the Hollybrook Memorial in Southampton, and the Holyhead War Memorial located in Holyhead, Anglesey. And in fact, her anchor was actually turned into a monument that is still at Holyhead today. In October 2014, there were calls for the wreck of Anglia to be designated as a war grave. And by March 2017, it was made official. So it is now illegal to remove or disturb anything at the wreck site.
Now, we've covered other wrecks, some which are still visible, some that we know where they are, littered around the English coastline, and particularly around the Kent coastline. That's why stories like this fascinate me, is because there are so many, often, let's face it, terrible stories, human stories, that are hidden beneath the waves. Because we don't see them every day, there are no visible reminders of those, they're easy to forget, and we should never forget stories like this. And Anglia is just one of many stories, tragic stories, hidden beneath the English Channel.
In another era, the loss of Anglia would have dominated headlines for months, years. But of course, 1915 was not a normal year. And with ongoing battles and disasters consuming entire newspaper front pages for weeks and months and years, with thousands dying every week, even a disaster of this magnitude struggled to remain in the public memory for long.
Thank you for watching today's video. Another important First World War story that should really be remembered. And I know many of them are very well, but this is one I found that I felt there wasn't a lot out there about. And like I've said before, in the huge, awful case of something like a world war, there are loads of awful stories, and it's easy to blend them all into just one big, horrible disaster. But it's important to focus down on individual stories like this that might get lost in the bigger picture. So thank you for watching. If you found the video interesting, remember to like and subscribe for more content like this. And if you've got any suggestions for other wartime stories you'd like me to cover, other places you'd like me to go, then feel free to leave a comment down below. And as always, I'll see you in the next one.